You're listening to the Be Better Off Show by Kelly+Partners.
Welcome to the Be Better Off Show, where we find great Australians to share their insights on being healthier, wealthier and wiser. And this morning we've got Ross Greenwood, the business editor of Sky News. Every day, 4:30, he hosts the Business Now show, 11 a.m. on the weekend, business weekend. Good morning, Ross.
Yeah, g'day, Brett. Good to be with you, mate, as always.
Mate, so good to see you. Now, it's been a while. I think it was beginning of COVID we first had a chat. What can you share about the economy as you see it now? We've been through COVID. Now we've got a war in Europe. Nothing too major going on around the world.
It's bizarre, isn't it? I'm just sitting there thinking, in the past 10 years, 12 years, we've seen tsunamis. We've seen them wipe out nuclear reactors. We've basically had a pandemic. We've now got a war. We've seen all sorts of floods, bushfires like we've never seen. I'm just waiting for the alien invasion to sort of have every horror movie genre that there has ever been sort of like witnessed by human beings. And it's all happening in such a very short space of time. So it's almost as though you've got to expect the unexpected right now. And this is the curiosity. If you went back 8 weeks ago and spoke to the ordinary person and said, will Russia invade Ukraine? The answer would have been no. Could fuel prices be $2.20 a litre, give or take? The answer would have been no. If you'd gone back 4 years, 5 years ago, when there was a crippling drought, could you have imagined that wheat prices would be where they are today and that farmers would be probably having some of their most prosperous years? And the answer was that many of them walked away and couldn't imagine that. So it's one of these situations right now where people have just got to understand that this is volatility. This is in volatility in economies, volatility in the geopolitical situation, in the leadership around the world. And so really, even investors, business people have got to recognize that volatility. They've got to basically set their nerve against that, make their businesses sort of, if you like, proof ready for whatever comes, because who could have imagined a pandemic would close down so many businesses for such a long period of time? And that's cut a hole in the federal government's budget and other governments' budgets besides, and it just makes it harder. There's less flexibility around the place. So really, it is a case where you've got to look after yourself and look after your business, look after your workers, number one. And, it's tough because, I sit there and think about people, say, for example, in Lismore at the moment, that's a big city. How does that city ever recover, given the fact that no insurer will ever insure a business there again for flood? So if they're not insured, many of those businesses go broke, which means their workers lose jobs. If their workers lose jobs, they can't pay mortgages. So the whole thing's a revolving sort of almost turmoil for those people. Same thing after bushfires, very, very hard. So, this is the way in which the world is changing. And the challenges keep being presented to people. I think that's the key, Brett.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So the RBA tells us the following. GDP in Australia is up 3.5% on pre-COVID levels. Households have extra savings. 50% of borrowers are 2 years ahead on their pre-COVID mortgages.
Yeah.
Loan arrears rates are declining. Household balance sheets are in good shape. Unemployment rates 4.2% and going lower, expected to be below 4% for the first time since 1970. And underemployment has also come down. So the RBA's commentary is that there's a resilient economy, strong labour market, strong household balance sheets and strong banks. But then you throw in Ukraine, COVID, Ukraine, and now what looks like a developing and very serious COVID situation in China. And the commentary has been that there's 8% inflation in the US.
Yeah.
2 to 3% here, 1% in Asia, Japan and China. And the real question, I think, is if supply chains are severely disrupted, where can inflation go? What does that do? And I guess, taking from where the RBA play down to the real world where you and I, hang around, those businesses in Lismore, notwithstanding whether household balance sheets are in good shape or not in good shape, many, many small businesses have been severely impacted. And so while the macro situation looks strong for Australia, 8% inflation and 3% wages growth, which is the US picture, feels like a picture that could come here, and I can't see it ending well.
So, you've mentioned the Reserve Bank there. And I mean, This is the same Reserve Bank that told us that interest rates weren't going anywhere until 2024 and we're going to stay at record lows. This is the same Reserve Bank that got its inflation targeting wrong for the best part of 8 years. This is the same Reserve Bank that basically is, sort of, if you like, tried to suggest that unemployment rate is going down to 3% and won't move interest rates until they start to see wages inflation come, despite the fact that you mentioned where inflation is in Australia right now, sitting right in the middle of their 2 to 3% band. But nobody believes that because everybody understands that that's a backward-looking number. But the forward-looking number is that it is going up, that interest rates will have to go up, that they did get it wrong, and ultimately they're going to have to raise interest rates at least 2 or 3 times this year just so that they don't get behind the curve, because that's even worse. Because there's another fundamental problem with this, is despite the fact that the economy has gone so well, I can't for the life of me understand why the Reserve Bank wasn't raising interest rates when housing prices were rising by 20% last year, just to take the edge off some of that, and also to build a buffer in case there was some global event that took place. And hello, we've got one in the shape of Russia invading Ukraine. But then you go even further forward and say, well, the time to be raising interest rates is not when you're waiting to see what the numbers were from 3 or 6 months ago. The time is when you actually understand what's taking place in the economy right now. So, it is a case whereby interest rates are going up. It is a case where inflation is going up. It is a situation where that is not a good situation, because long-term inflation basically is the enemy of employment, because businesses generally tend to sit on their capital because they know that their debts are being eroded away by that inflation. And at the same time, there is less incentive to really become, if you like, a productive sort of, if you like, employer and a grower of businesses at that time. So the interesting thing about Australia right now, the one thing saving Australia, which is phenomenal, and this is partly as a result of the Reserve Bank basically undercooking the interest rate story, is the Australian dollar. If the Australian dollar were not 72, 73 US cents, given the fact that we've seen oil prices at $140 a barrel, given the fact you've seen the iron ore price getting out towards basically $150 a tonne, given the fact you've seen the coal price, the energy price,
and virtually every other commodity is up 20.
Wheat prices have doubled in the year. If you look back to 2007, 2008, the Australian dollar should be $1.10 at the moment, technically. But it's only because the Reserve Bank has got this very negative view of interest rates and try to hold them down when the rest of the world is raising rates, that our dollar has stayed where it is right now. Now, that's been, in some ways, a saviour of many of the farmers and of miners who are absolutely cooking with gas at the moment. I mean, they're making more money than ever. Have a look at the Rio Tinto results. Have a look at the BHP results, Fortescue results, all of these. And the other one, Graincorp, is absolutely flying at the moment, Elders as well. But then you go back a couple of steps and you say, well, hang on, but that's all very well for that side of the economy. But for the other side of the economy, it really is a situation where that starts to crimp a little bit of domestic demand, because, we're not out and spending, we're not traveling, we're not doing those things. So it hurts airlines, it hurts travel companies, it hurts many of those. And so it really is one of these situations where it's almost a two-edged sword at this stage, because the price of our imports, including fuel in particular, are rising hard. And that, again, is where the number one thing that affects consumer confidence is not interest rates, it's fuel, it's petrol. Because people recognise and understand the price of petrol more than they understand any other consumer good. And when historically petrol prices have risen, people generally do not feel as good about their personal circumstances, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, they're paying interest rates with a 1 or a 2 in front of it at the moment.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. So I think what you've hit on there is that petrol prices are the one place that consumers notice inflation.
Oh, yeah.
So I had a team member say to me yesterday, who normally catches a train, and the train line is, affected up on the Northern Line here from floods. They're repairing it. And I said, well, look, if it took an hour, why don't you just drive down and I'll pay for your parking? And they said, Brett, have you seen the cost of fuel?
Yeah.
So, and this is not a person on, $3 an hour. So, this is a very well-paid team member. So I think, the RBA have made some comments that 20% of Australians are under enterprise agreements that turn every 3 years, 25% are under annual awards, 20% of public sector employees with 1.5 to 2.5% maximum wage increases. I feel like the bit that commentary is missing is that all of those systems require public cooperation. And I often think that, that Brexit and Trump and the truckers, and I think the war in Ukraine, I'll come to that, are a result of one group of people not hearing other people. And if you have inflation at 8% and wages growth at 1.5 to 2.5%, then I don't think it's intelligent to assume that those systems hold. We've had rail situations here recently. There is no reason that if people feel that they've got a real wage pay cut of 5% a year, that they don't simply down tools and say, I'm not accepting your award, I'm not accepting your public. And this is just not in the policy thinking of the technocrats at all. They think.
Well, it's a fabulous point you make, and the reason for that is, then take it one step further. Every time an enterprise bargaining agreement comes up for renewal, that is now a very hard negotiation, because unions and employees are going to go hard for more wages, right? You've actually had even Josh Frydenberg, the treasurer, tell people, listen, if you need a wage rise, you better change jobs, because there's demand out there for labour. So, you're right. You've got a rising cost of living. You've got a potentially more mobile workforce. You don't yet have the number of inbound students and tourists that we anticipated when the borders were reopened.
Ross, they also make the point, the RBA also make the point that inbounds don't really do anything, because when they land, yes, they add to the labour force, but they also create demand for services and other goods. And over time, they see that as a net.
It's interesting, isn't it? So then go back to
the productivity increases, and we've had none in 10 years.
Well, that's so true. That is the key, is to try and improve productivity, which means you've got to give incentive for people to work. I wonder whether one productivity improvement has actually come out of COVID, where businesses have learned to trust their workers working at home, doing it like this, right? People do turn up. And whether that productivity, to understand that if somebody goes and puts on the washing or sticks the dinner on or goes and picks up the kids from school, does not make them less productive, because they're not travelling to and from an office and not worrying about where the kids are. I think that's a change in culture more than anything else. And businesses, not all businesses can do it, but a lot of businesses have had to learn to adapt and recognise that this is a way to hold their employees as well. But when I talk to my mate, who's one of the biggest pub owners in Australia, and he tells me that the chef that he previously was hiring for $90,000 is now basically asking for $130,000, and he's got to pay it, otherwise he'll lose that chef to one of his competitors. Well, there is genuine inflation coming in there. But then there's a second factor about this. Remember, with house prices having risen more than 20% in every capital city last year, that you've got to, if you're living in Melbourne and Sydney, have two jobs to make that work. So as a result, from a labour point of view, you cannot largely pay a mortgage in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane to a lesser extent, Adelaide to a lesser extent. Perth is now playing a bit of catch up, unless you've got two people working in the household, which puts, or you've got one person running a business, one person out producing a bit of cash flow for the mortgage. What I'm trying to explain here is inside businesses, but inside families, even though there is prosperity, there is also pressure.
So the earlier point we were making is that interest rates are holding the dollar down. If they rise, the inflood of capital in a virtually zero yield world where government bonds are basically zero will be overwhelming. So the dollar will be over $1. It'll be $1.10, which is great if you want to go to Disneyland, but not great for your balance of payments with your exporters. Your psychology of inflation, which is another thing that the RBA are big on, which is, will businesses put prices up, and how willing are they? Now they're seeing movement where Woolies and Coles are able to say to people, hey, you can see the cost of inputs going up. This is where petrol prices do help businesses. Hey, you can see prices going up, so we have to put our prices up. But the flip side of that is, as soon as you get, for at least 15 years, there's been virtually no movement in prices in virtually everything, because this psychology has been, given how competitive the economy is, you can't raise your prices. But as soon as that psychology takes hold, then you've got a very different economy. And I think to the point you've just made is that if people have seen, I guess what I see in the US is the fracturing of the social compact. I will work my public sector job because you pay me, but if I go backwards 5% a year, I might be less cooperative. If I can't buy a house that I used to be able to buy because it's gone up by 50%, and so even if I'm a good participant in the economy, me and my partner are both qualified, we both work very hard, we're prudent with our money, but we have no prospects of buying any property or a property that we think is commensurate with our station in life, then the sort of disincentive effects to participate, notwithstanding we've got the highest participation rates on record, start to look interesting.
Well, also the second thing is what you get a migration take place as a result of that. And what you've seen that already in Hobart, say, for example, is where property prices have run off the charts because people have realised that they're effectively being squeezed out if they're in public sector jobs. So we're talking police officers, AMBOs, we're talking teachers, we're talking nurses.
Well, essential workers.
Essential workers that you need to run a big capital city. So if you've got Sydney at, approaching 5 million people, Melbourne growing even faster, you need those people in your cities. But if those people cannot afford to be in those cities, so they go either to regional areas. And remember, last year during COVID, you saw big run-ups in regional property prices, not just people buying second houses, but people choosing to move out of capital cities and raise their families there. You're seeing the same thing in Adelaide. You're seeing the same thing in Perth, in Brisbane, in Hobart. And so as a result, you suddenly have a lot of people who otherwise would be highly productive, very essential workers in your big capital cities, suddenly departing. What you also get is you get a movement of property prices commensurate with that migration. Migration is always the thing that fuels property prices. And it's the one thing, it's also about when the population moved to southeast Queensland, when they moved back into the big cities of Melbourne and Sydney and the growth in the population there, that's the thing that triggers the house prices. When you had the big Chinese diaspora into Sydney, that's what really fueled the apartments being built and the property prices going at that stage. So, it's one of the big keys when you're looking for the future of property prices. You always look at the movement of migration. But I want to go back
growth. Often when people think of migration, they think of inbound migration, but really it's movement it's the growth in number of people, no matter where they come from. If it's internal movement of people from Sydney,
totally.
We're up in Queensland at Christmas, and property prices in southeast Queensland are up 50%.
Yeah,
and it is every second person has moved from Melbourne.
That's right.
I got sick of the lockdowns, and you're like, oh, mate's running a cafe. Where'd you come from? Melbourne. The quality of the coffee's gone through the roof, Ross.
That's exactly right. But I want to take you back one step. You talked about the Coles and Woolies and the inflation and moving food prices and stuff. The greatest barometer of that, in my opinion, is Costco. Right now, I've known Costco for a long time, since they landed on our shores, and from having seen them in the States and in the UK when I've been there in the past. And Patrick Noon is the chief executive of Costco in Australia, and he's a bit of a mate, and I've known him very, very well since he basically set up their first warehouse here in Australia. Now, the interesting thing about Costco is that they have made basically their fortune to become one of the biggest retailers in the world off the back of being able to access. It doesn't matter whether it's Levi jeans or whether it's diamonds or whether it's coffins or whether it's foodstuffs, chickens or fruit and vegetables, whatever it is, as cheap as you possibly can. And so what they do every quarter, every half year, is all of their buyers around the world and their chief executives all sit in the same place. Normally they go away, now they're doing it online. And they sit down, the chief executive is in the US and basically says, right, butter prices in America are rising for the first time in 15 years. We've never seen butter prices rise. Who around the world can get me cheap butter? And basically they go around the table and they're all basically networking, figuring out where they can get the cheap butter, where they can get cheap wine, where they can get cheap whatever it is that they need.
And now everyone's saying nowhere.
And that's the problem. There's your fundamental problem. And so when you've got the very best supply chain, and indeed here in Australia, there are businesses that have actually been created out of the back of either Aldi or indeed out of Costco, needing to source goods which can be then provided to the world. And there have been some phenomenal success stories here in Australia as a result of exactly that supply chain. Now, the problem is if all of a sudden you're priced out of this It makes it very, very hard. Australia, though, still retains its competitive advantage because, say, for example, wheat, flour milling, any of that sort of stuff right now where you can export that. When the Australian dollar is so low, you've got an advantage. But I've got to say, it's a window of opportunity that doesn't necessarily last very long. One last thing about this as well. Remember that it doesn't matter where you live now. We're just talking about people moving to regional areas. If we had not gone through the pandemic with NBN and with high-speed broadband, the unemployment rate in Australia would have probably exceeded its previous highest point above 11%. Now, the fact that we had that ability to keep employees attached to their companies and to their businesses and to their workplace, and that was as a result of high-speed broadband. But the second aspect of the high-speed broadband is it does not matter where you live in Australia anymore. You can live in the boondocks somewhere and you can still trade. You can actually go and create a business. You can succeed in ways that you have never been able to.
It's very interesting. So the commentary is, okay, what do you do to move productivity? And productivity, bottom line, the federal government's borrowed $1 trillion. How do you pay that debt back? You pay it back by making the economy more efficient, more productive, so that you can grow the economy, so that your debt as a proportion of your economy is low, and you can pay back your debt faster.
Yeah, can I?
The other way to do that's productivity.
Well, that's one way. There's another way. If I'm cynical, you could have a bout of inflation, and you could actually inflate some of that debt away in real terms.
Well, that's so to me, I think that's. I have a very strong suspicion that
don't imagine that the US Treasury and that the US sort of head of Treasury, don't imagine that they haven't thought about that, because they've got so much debt. And remember, a bout of inflation might have consequences for society. So there's another small issue. So you've got to now go back to the 1980s and early 1990s. So we're talking. Yeah, that's right. So we're talking 30, 40 years ago. So if you didn't live through those times, you didn't understand that, number one, if there was a period of inflation, that during that period of time, if you can access debt cheaply, that you've got to access that debt and you've got to buy hard assets. And the reason for that is that
you're a winner, like a big driver of inequality.
Exactly. That is precisely it, because what happens is that the asset prices are driven up by inflation, but in real terms, your debt is driven down by inflation. And so the aspect here, now you've got to be careful of this, because there is a point at which, I always say this, that the Reserve Bank, people will cope, business will cope with interest rate rises. And indeed, the first 2, 3, 4, 5 interest rate rises, no dramas at all. The one the interest rate rise, it's too many, is the last one. And you don't know whether that's 6 or 7 or 5 or whatever it is, but there's one last one they'll always go for, and that will put it on. And at that point in time, those people with the assets and the debts have got to be very careful of the shocks that do come. But in the meantime, so long as you're nimble, so long as you've got a pretty agile mind and investment portfolio, it is actually not a bad way to drive wealth. But so long as you've also got something sitting in your back pocket to recognise that if there is a shock in the future, you can actually then go and pick up cheap assets, which is the other way to actually acquire that wealth very rapidly, then I think that's the key. So, again, right now, no problems putting your money into something that's paying you 7% that's on, sort of some mortgage-backed sort of investment. The reality is that's all absolutely fine until the interest rate rises for that last time. The last one, that's always the killer, right?
So you have to grow productivity in theory.
Yes.
You grow productivity by infrastructure investment, and I was coming to that. The NBN is the best example. So, serious investment in infrastructure that delivers economic productivity, the NBN or technology generally that allows a distributed workforce, increases participation rates. It's a winner-winner chicken dinner. Training of your people is the other one, which Australian employers have cut dramatically over the last 15 years. They'd prefer to outsource and do other things, but as the global, demand for labour is higher than the labour that exists. You do need to get back to that tradition of training people to actually be more effective. And then when you go to your point that governments are incentivised to inflate away their debt, there's two things that I think about there. So at the moment, the settings in Australia are going to drive a higher proportion of the pie to government and to commodity owners. That'll go away from private businesses, smaller businesses, and the private economy, if you like. Problem with that is that economy employs 70% of all Australians. So, you get a balanced budget, but unemployment, they're not worried about unemployment at the moment. But to your point, the people with the most debt globally are not private individuals or household balance sheets, it's governments.
Yep.
So the question is, I'd been saying to clients, well, look, the governments can raise interest rates, but they're incentivized perversely to keep rates down because they're the ones who are paying the most interest.
Yeah.
So you have this global policy conflict of, well, the Fed in the US, they're going to raise interest rates because that's the prudent thing to do. Problem is they're carrying so much debt that they're not an independent adjudicator anymore of what's prudent for the globe, for the economy globally.
I'll give you another little sort of offbeat example on this. So you know how there's at the moment with fuel prices having gone through the roof, that there's been this argument, well, maybe what should happen is that, there should be some sort of like cut of the excise, like cut the excise, 44.2 cents a litre, whatever it is. And as a result, everybody can have cheaper petrol. Well, okay, that's okay. You can say that, but that's $5 billion or so, $5 to $6 billion that comes out of the budget. Where's that $5 or $6 billion come from, right? The government takes in about...
So long as you cut some government program for $5 billion, which they won't be too keen to do.
No, they won't do that.
They can't do that. Maybe you could pump some petrol in Australia.
But what I'm saying is the budget is a pot of money, right? There's only so much in that pot. So you can sit there and say, we'll take pressure off petrol prices. There's $5 billion gone. The $5 billion's got to come from somewhere, or you're going to borrow that $5 billion every year. So, this is what people are not recognising, that pot of money of about $500 billion a year, half of that money comes from you and me, PAYE taxpayers.
So firstly, that pot of money isn't the government's, it comes from Australians.
From Australians, it's our money, right?
Half of it's PAYG and half it's corporate. And then the question is, well, who wants a tax rate increase?
Well, that's precisely right. So would you prefer to have your $5 billion, let's say the government pretends that it wants to do that? Is it productive to do it that way, taking the tax off fuel, or is it more productive to actually cut your tax rates, to encourage people, give them the incentive to work a bit harder? So, this is again something that people don't think about.
We're on tax reform. So this is a good one. And it'll be hard to avoid politics here, but on both sides of the political discussion from a tax policy perspective, and that's not just here in Australia, but it is in the Western world generally, the UK, the US, etc. There appears to be less ability to come to any sort of political consensus on anything. And tax reform is probably the best example where in Australia, a PAYG worker is dramatically overtaxed.
Yeah.
Gains on capital, lazy capital, so property gains, for example, from a policy perspective, are undertaxed.
But as we found out at the last election, you can't change that because that was Bill Shorten going in and suggesting the change.
Yeah, so we'll come to the politics. A stamp duty tax on property is a tax on mobility in an economy that you want people to be mobile and agile. So that's ridiculous. A payroll tax is a tax on an employer actually offering someone a job, which seems to be ridiculously, mind-blowingly stupid, given the alternative for that employer is to employ that person offshore using the internet where you pay no payroll tax.
Yeah.
So we have an 18th century tax system for a 22nd century world.
Yeah.
But we don't have the maturity in the political class or system. Firstly, I don't think they understand tax well enough to be able to explain any changes they might want to make outside ideological, sort of 1950s ideological shitfights. Where do we go?
Well, it's just too hard. 3-year election cycles don't help. Then you've got a situation where you've got the politics of, adversarial, sort of combat, which means that, you're basically not getting consensus. Then you've got marginal politicians in there who are independents and others who agitate for causes. And so, again, you get the lack of consensus. But you're right. If you want productivity gains, you've got to go to that real root and branch change to our tax system that Ken Henry advocated when he put down his report, which is now, 2007,
nearly 10
2009,
years
so even older, right? So you sit there and you go, this is nuts that we did none of that, right? Absolutely none of that. And so, it's about trying to create a more efficient society, which gives incentive to work, which gives incentive to start a business, which gives greater incentive to really get out there and try and make money and employ people. That should be the priority number 1, 2, and 3. In actual fact, it's not, because there are so many and in many cases, very special needs that need to be met. And we're a, first world economy, one of the wealthiest economies in the world. And yet we still have these arguments. which seems absolutely crazy, without being able to sit down and work out what your priorities are for spending, to make certain that the aged are cared for, to make certain that vulnerable people are cared for, to make certain that the unemployed are cared for until it's shown that they're taking the mickey, right? The whole point about this is that you've got to have that element of care in your society to make certain that it's a functioning society. But then on the other side, you've got to give enormous care and credit to those people who create businesses, who employ people, and try and make certain that those people, are really able to use their capital properly, to continue to invest, and to take great ideas, great inventions that Australia has got, take them to the world. Because, we have these ideas. And to be honest, some of these are starting to filter through now. The one thing I'm starting to see, which is a great news story, is that manufacturing is being reborn in Australia. And I'm not talking old-fashioned manufacturing, which like a pumping stuff out in the air. I'm talking really highly skilled, sort of computer chip companies. I'm seeing robotics companies. I'm seeing cars, electric vehicles being made in Australia. I mean, just some of this stuff is so clever and so smart and brilliantly coming out of our universities and our engineers. And it really gives me enormous hope for Australia, I've got to say. But for goodness sakes, I'd sit there and say, to try and do that here in Australia, is a great advantage if your tax system is working for you and encouraging every young science and engineering student, medical student coming out to have a red hot go and create some industry and some business here in Australia.
So it's really interesting, Ross. Like I think that it is possible to get consensus on how we should care for our population. The great thing that came out of the pandemic is, the strength of our universal healthcare system, where it's run well, was obvious and had great outcomes for our people, all people. So the idea that for every Australian I know across the political spectrum, if you said we should have universal healthcare, I think it's kind of a settled position.
It works, right? Everybody understands that, yeah.
We should have universal education, have a high standard, that we should look after the aged, that we should look after the disabled, that we should care for people who are unemployed. We're acknowledging that in a modern, extraordinarily competitive economy, while we're very quick to tell people they may have 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 careers in their lives, we're probably less honest to say that, it's possible that unemployment might afflict many people at different times during the changeover periods between those 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
And you've got to train those people at those times.
You've got to retrain them. You've got to retrain them, and that it's possible that through no fault of your own, you could end up unemployed. That there'll always be people who just don't have the IQ. They have some sort of moderate or severe disability or other thing that means that they're not going to find regular gainful employment. And there's going to be people with psychological and addiction and other human weaknesses that mean that they're just not going to be able to play the game. And so rather than shoot them or chuck them out or make them feel bad, we're going to care for them at some reasonable level. And if they're taken...
But isn't it reasonable to say that they are the significant minority? So you should be able to care for those people, right? The vast majority of people are working and they're productive. Exactly right. So the trick I've got, you've got to make certain you don't waste skill. I think that's the key, Brett. If somebody has skills or assets, if they lose a job somewhere, those skills must be adapted to work somewhere else. And surely that's what, and I think even the system right now does work a little bit like that to try and address many of those issues. That's the ideal of it anyway.
So I think we can do better in skills training, in terms of an argument over how strong TAFE should be. It should be ubiquitous and it should be so strong it's crazy, so that if you just want to study anything, you can walk in and basically study anything that's vocational, likely to lead to
Well, actually, I go back to that point because I've always been a strong advocate for TAFE. People would know that. And one of the worst things that the federal government did was to try and dismantle TAFE and go to those private education.
It was ideological. It was ideological and illogical.
Yeah. Why bust something that's working well? And having seen so many of the TAFEs, and seeing the product and the care and the way in which they actually train on the job, seeing kids of 17 building a house for the community and all that sort of stuff as part of their training is just a wonderful uplifting thing to see.
Like Ross, I feel like that's an example of a political football that is just bullshit on both sides, and that with some maturity, it's like you feel like I feel like grabbing you and you get the leaders of two parties, you bang their heads together, tell them to grow up and fund the thing and get on with it, and actually address the real issues. So I do think Australians, there is a consensus around care rather than a political consensus. I do think Australians care about people, and they do care about each other. And then this incentive bit, follow the incentives, you'll know the behaviour. The idea that, at a point, you're better off to buy a house than employ another person because the housing will increase risk-free at a rate where you don't have to do anything. But, if you build a business and then you sell it, you pay the same capital gains tax rate as you do if you buy a house and you sell it. Yeah, which is just mental. Anyone who's ever employed a person kind of understands the difference, but many people in the political class never have, so they just don't get it. So I'm sort of passionate about that. We interviewed for the podcast the other day, company just here in Sydney, northwest Sydney, Clean Space. So a leading manufacturer of ventilators, private, ventilation, the best equipment in the world for high-risk industrial jobs and healthcare and all the rest of it. It's 100% manufactured and developed here in Australia. There's R&D going on. The engineers came out of ResMed. It's an incredible story of high-end manufacturing. But when you look at it, if you've ever built a business, you understand what's involved. The incentives are so often pointed to shifting manufacturing offshore and all the rest of it. Yeah. So look, I guess two things I really want to cover with you is that, from here is, one, I'm a huge proponent of industry policy, of picking winners, and many of the people I find on the right are, against industry policy, against picking winners. I'll come to why I think that. The other one I want to talk about is defence and its impact on our budget going forward. Yeah. On industry policy, interested in your thoughts. We had in South Australia a car building industry for 1,000 years that we'd spent, X trillions of dollars of some, number you can't calculate investing in. And rather than go and say to Tesla, hey, come here, put a factory and use all this talent and supply chain and pay them to be here or pay someone to be here, we just appeared to say, oh, well, ideology again, we couldn't intervene there. That would be silly. On the other hand, we decided we'd be able to build a submarine that, apparently we can't build a car, but we can build a submarine. So that seemed completely fucking ridiculous.
Yeah.
What's your view on industry policy?
Broadly, I'll go the opposite to you. Broadly, I'd say, look, why on earth would we build a car here in Australia that people don't want, that is overpriced as compared with its overseas competitor, when you can, and as we have now, Australians have some of the best cars in the world. We have some of the youngest fleet in the world. So does it make sense to actually make cars here, which A, people don't want, and which B, people, because you have a look at the sedans now, and you have a look at the, sort of, as they were being phased out, the Commodores, the Falcons, the collapse.
Yeah, everyone's in an SUV. But if we have the facility there, can't we donate it to a Tesla and say, well, look, we'll give you some tax breaks or some incentives to come and create some high-tech jobs? And
yeah, but look, my gut feel is you haven't lost the IP. And in Australia right now, the IP to create cars is phenomenal. And so, we will eventually
still have the luxury car tax.
Yeah, that's true. That's another problem, which is nuts, I would say.
So we're paying 3 times the price for a car here in Australia in service that you pay anywhere else in the world.
But Brett, we still make vehicles here. We make Kenworth trucks, right, which are some of the finest, sort of transport trucks in the world. We make Bushmaster, sort of fighting vehicles, which are sold all over the world. Yep. So we do make vehicles. We just don't make sedan cars. So my theory is that
should we make submarines?
Probably not, but that's a political and employment job, right? So the fact of the matter is, the answer is probably not. You probably should buy the submarines, but then, I guess by making them here, you also hold some of the IP over some of your key defence assets. That's one of the answers to it. We did make the destroyers here. We made very, very good destroyers here, which have served their purpose and really been, industry building at that time. So, again, that's a political decision. That is not a pragmatic economic decision, because that's about creating labour and trying to hold skills in this country.
That's defence. So when we come to defence, we see I have the view that the Ukraine war is, US agitated, Chinese sponsored. We're unprepared for a war in Europe. We're less prepared for a war in Asia. Our supply chain is non-existent in terms of, our defense readiness is poor.
Yes.
The Germans come out and say, look, we need to spend 100 billion on defense, and we need to do that now. What do you see, in terms of proportion of budget needing to go to defense? Because in the last 30 years, effectively we've been spending that on education, healthcare, or other things, other social.
Yeah, well, that's true. Or social security, or tax breaks, or whatever it might be that, people have wanted to. In other words, we've been very fortunate. And it sounds strange, though he is a prior to many. Donald Trump was right about this, was that the world basically got lazy on the back of the US, basically providing that support. And so the world did not invest enough in its own defence. Australia certainly did not carry its weight when it came to its defence capabilities. And this is the reason why we've got ourselves into a pickle now in terms of the amount of defence capacity we've got. And look, you do need to have some sense of defence to make certain that you are at least seen to be credible in the eyes of those people who might oppose you. It doesn't matter who it might be. So, when you've got Russia making its advances on Ukraine, which appears to have been totally and utterly miscalculated by, Vladimir Putin and his, and these people around him, in terms of the defence of its own sovereignty, that the Ukrainian people were astonishing in terms of their defence.
Yeah, so Ross, we think that, like we are being told that, Putin, to my knowledge, never came out and said, I think the war will be over in 2 days. That came from the US Defense Secretary, I believe, who up front said they'll invade and it'll be a 2-day job.
But my gut feel was that they didn't expect to have to go and demolish Kiev or, Lviv, all these types of towns on the way through.
I think we're taking our Western perspective, in terms of everything I've watched says that the Russian way of doing war is to surround a city and flatten it. Yeah. Now, they appear to be doing that. And we don't, I think we tell ourselves that, it would be nicer if it was a 2-day, firecrackers and a negotiated settlement. But what happens if we're completely wrong? What happens if really Putin's agenda is no, this is the territory through which Russia has always been invaded. So we will flatten the thing, we'll make it impenetrable to our adversaries, and we'll make sure that the US know and NATO that, we're not playing that game. What happens if they're not driven by our values and they don't really care if they're a bit poorer than they were yesterday? They're pretty poor to start with.
I think you've got to recognise that they are not driven by our values. I think that's absolutely the first thing that you've got to suggest. But then it makes the world a lot less secure. It makes even our position in the world a lot less secure, given the fact that China is clearly in some way allied with Russia, and its values and senses are not dissimilar to those of Russia in terms of trying to be seen as a significant and feared power in the world, that it will not be bullied effectively by the United States in its own mind. And so as a result of that, you can see that even with the trade war that's taken place here with Australia, that China has decided that it will assert itself against Australia. Now, you go next door to New Zealand. China has not asserted itself against New Zealand. In fact, the free trade agreement hums along, swimmingly for New Zealand. And certainly New Zealand has not done terribly much to agitate China along the way. But, it's a pretty cute game that the Kiwis have played. So, this is something where, again, you've got to stand up for your national identity. You've got to understand what that national identity is. You've got to stand up for your own position in the world and your own position in your region. And I think this is the reason why, again, you go back to the defence side of it, 2% of the budget allocated to defence spending at a minimal, you'd have to say is pretty much it, which, based on our numbers so far, that's about $10 billion a year. But you've also got to have people who are ready and prepared to fight. You've got to have the armed forces in place. The problem I have right now is much of the talk about defence spending is way out in the next 20 and 30 years, when in actual fact, the urgency for the need for resources might be very much closer than that. And that's one of the keys. That's not suggesting there's war or anything, but it means that you need to be beefed up so that others cannot come in and try and push you around or bully you or, make intentions that you can't respond to. I think that's really important that Australia does have some sort of basic defence as its core, even if that means trying to keep supply lines open for fuel, to Singapore, to pharmaceuticals, to other traded goods, that an island that can't produce these things in sufficient quantities itself needs very much to be able to cope to make certain that those lines of trade are very much open for us.
Yeah, so we know from World War II that keeping the lines to Singapore open is impossible, that if the Russian Navy cooperated with the Chinese Navy, Biden appears to have forced those two into bed together, that the US can't resist that situation. We're entirely dependent on the US for our defence. We've made ourselves that. The defence spending proposed is in 30 years' time and is insignificant. It doesn't involve any sort of nuclear protection, which is odd. It's, if you took a 50-year view and we're being told that climate change is I think it was Rudd's words, the great moral challenge of our time. You got John Kerry running around the world like a clown, imagining that that's the most pressing issue facing the West. When it does appear that today, if you took a straw poll in Europe, you may well find that Russian aggression is a more short-term and potentially more catastrophic risk to Europe than climate change.
Oh, well, that's so true. But then you sit there and think about the whole notion of climate change. So Australia is one of the largest producers of uranium in the world. We don't use it. We now have always been one of the best and largest producers of both energy coal and of metallurgical coal in the world. We use it for metallurgical coal to make steel. BlueScope does that. But then we don't want to use the energy coal. So we're going to send that out somewhere else to be burned. So again, it seems as though the things that we have, we don't use very well. And that, in particular, the nuclear stuff. If you want to have nuclear capability, you've got to be able to use that. And it was interesting because only in the last week or so, I was out at ANSTO at Lucas Heights. And I've been out there now 4 times or so. And twice I've sort of leant over the reactor there. And basically, it's producing, almost the majority of nuclear medicine in the world. It is something that is highly productive. We have a nuclear reactor that's operated here since the 1950s. I mean, it's just incredible to think that people are so anti it, despite the fact that we've got one on the outskirts of Sydney. It seems nuts to me that, that we somehow are fearful of this.
Yeah, the ideological, again, at odds with logic. It's interesting that the Germans are now saying, well, we'll need to turn on some of our nuclear reactors again. The Italians are saying we're going to turn on our coal-fired power stations again. It's like we've been living in this fantasy delusion where you can immediately change power sources with technology that is unproven, that the implements are manufactured by your adversary. Not afraid.
And what happened here, Brett, was that the philosophy got ahead of the reality. That's what happened. And so, the philosophy might be fine. Let's live in a carbon-free world. Let's not emit. Let's not do a whole bunch of other things. Let's have cheap source of electricity. But hang on, is the reality that right now that we can do that? Is the science there yet that we can do that? And the science would have to be said.
Transition in an unstable world. We presume that we can make that transition in a world of the last 70 years where there's largely been peace and prosperity. But if there's not peace and prosperity, will you have bigger call? Will there be higher level calls on your resources, your talent and efforts if just maintaining the peace requires a much larger share of the budget? That's the bit that it's like, okay, we're going to spend X trillions on transition to clean energy. Well, what happens if those trillions have to be spent on defence? There's a great podcast the other day I listened to by Yuval Noah Harari, who's the well-known author of *Sapiens* and others, and he says, look, what people are not seeing is that this new world order created by Russian aggression sponsored by the Chinese, who don't share our values, means that a much higher proportion of national budgets will have to go to defence. And the prosperity over the last 70 years that we've experienced in the West has been underwritten by declining defence spending. And that's what's funded healthcare and education and training and disability programs and all sorts of social programs that have made life much more comfortable for people. But if you have to now turn around and stop, and start spending very, very significant proportions. Now he's talking up to 10% of your budget on defence.
Wow.
Which is, he says that if you look backwards over the 100 years prior the end of the Second World War, the typical national spend was between 10 and 40%. He says if the government's spending between 10 and 40% of their budget on defence, then what do you stop spending money on? And he said that's why you didn't have the health care. That's why you didn't have the disability programs. That's why you didn't have the education. And the general level of society was very much poorer for it. So it seems, to me, defence is not simply a matter of somebody might throw a bomb at you, what are you going to throw back? But the economic implications of I was in Italy some years ago, I think it's 3 or 4 years ago, when Trump met with NATO, and it's become quite a famous exchange with Stoltenberg, who runs NATO. The video's now gone around where he's just berating them about their refusal to spend 2% of GDP. And that basically the Americans topping up NATO for everything that the NATO.
I remember this, yeah.
And he was largely pilloried. I was in Rome and I'm reading the Australian media, and Trump's a devil and being pilloried. How dare he speak in such uncouth terms? Notwithstanding whether the content was true or not, it seemed to be more a style issue. But we go forward 4 years, and the Germans have now said, well, we're going to spend 100 billion. But what NATO have had to admit is that they don't have a fighting force that can fight Russia today. If the Russians take Ukraine and cross the border in Poland, then NATO cannot meet their force. And that has come out from NATO. They can't put a fighting force on the ground of 200,000 troops to take on 200,000 Russians coming across the border in Poland.
It's going to be interesting unless they get the battle for the skies. But the other small thing about that... It's a staggering
situation to have allowed to develop.
So you go back one step about this as well. You can't imagine that Vladimir Putin right now is counting his carbon emissions from his tanks and his military going across into Ukraine, or indeed offsetting those carbon emissions by doing something else. So, this is where it's completely nuts. And as you say, the values of the West are thoroughly different to the values of China, of Russia, of places that are, if you like, taking a different attitude towards the world, taking a different view towards the way in which the planet will evolve, I would say.
So Putin secures Ukraine, which I think no one's in any doubt that he will. He will own 40% of the food product of Europe. He'll own many of the key commodities and metals and other things.
Much of the gas, much of the nickel, much of the chromium, right? So these are things that are important.
Correct. So it's, he's basically, if you can think of him as the Warren Buffett of Russia, making an asset allocation decision on where he wants to invest. It's almost he's going long on hard assets that are hard materials, hard food productivity, hard gas, hard oil. And I saw a picture the other day of the natural assets that are owned by Ukraine.
Yes.
And as soon as you can turn your mind to saying, well, hang on, maybe he's really about food security. The Chinese are very interested in food security. Maybe he's interested in tying up the inputs that he needs for silicon chips and other things, much of which comes out of Ukraine. Then the sort of impost of that economically is defense spending rises, and it rises in a very material way across NATO. So yesterday I was listening again to economic commentary that said, well, Europe is headed into a recession, and faced with a recession, they are going to be hit with much greater demands to invest in defence, and they've just fed all of their people through COVID. So they're not in a position to deal with another COVID outbreak in terms of income support and other things.
And where does inflation go under those circumstances? It goes through the roof even more than what you've seen so far. So you've now got almost the worst scenario, which then says that you've got at some point in time, if that is your changing in priorities of government spending as well, then that cliff that's out there is a real cliff, and it's a significant cliff, for people who are not used to house prices rising.
Correct. So Europe, the issue for Europe is that where Australia, there is great hope that the economy can grow in real terms, and the same in the US. Europe is not, considering all of Europe. Germany is obviously different, but Europe generally isn't seen as having the ability to grow, to reduce the proportion that they've invested in COVID relief and other things. Now, if they have to turn around and spend significantly on defence, Germany can do it, but few other NATO countries can. So the pressure being pushed into Europe by Russia is manyfold. Massive increase in defence spending is sort of predicted by Trump some years ago. It would have been easier to do in increments over years, and have to stick out 100 billion in one. So
that bottom line means that people should probably buy some Rheinmetall shares and maybe a bit of gold as well on the way through. If that's your answer, isn't it? Really?
Well, I guess I'm not a doomsdayist, but because I believe in people's ingenuity and ability to innovate and to work through things. But I think that if we continue to delude ourselves that by making people rich, their values will change to agree with ours.
Yes,
that's a false narrative. And I think this situation with Ukraine should be the ultimate answer to that. That, what we've pursued for 30 years, make them richer and they'll turn into us.
Yeah, but what we're talking about is that there is risk in the world. People are going to be conscious of the risk. They've got to be understanding of the risk, and they've got to basically adapt to the risks that are sitting out there. This is not plain sailing. The risks have risen in the world. The risks have risen for investment in some ways. Maybe not short term, but certainly medium term, they have risen, and people have got to somehow make certain that they have insured themselves against those risks, protected themselves. That doesn't matter whether you're in business or whether you're a private portfolio holder, right?
Yeah, I think it's true that the government needs to take its chief risk officer role much more seriously. Yeah. I think for businesses, the first job of a business leader is risk management, and I think to presume that tomorrow is like yesterday is just wrong. And I think, as you say, in terms of portfolios, I guess, people have got used to expecting a base return of X. That, Warren Buffett, one of my great heroes, has always said that I keep him just here over my right arm. He's right there. He's right there. He's always said that you should aim for a 5% return. And if you get more, well, that's a bonus. And
because you'll lose it at some stage. It'll still average out at 5%. That's probably true as well.
He says if you go for more than 5, you're taking risks you probably don't understand. And I guess, for people in their portfolios, if most Australians, I guess, are underinvested. So they put less capital into productive investment than they could have, and they're probably underinsured.
So true. It's going to be fascinating to see just how it plays out. But that, as I say, risk is increasing. It's going to be fine for a while, even as interest rates rise. You've got interest rates rising, you've got inflation rising. You've got a situation where people have got enormous amounts of debt that they've taken on to buy hard assets, mainly houses. You've got global instability. And so you've got almost, in some ways, political inactivity because of our political system. These are all dangers. And these are all things that people have got to recognise and appreciate as they go about their everyday job, their business, they're investing. All these things need to be taken into account.
Yeah, absolutely. Great place to end. We're headed into a federal election in maybe May.
Yeah.
Depending on Warnie's funeral. Could be, we're not sure when that's going to be announced. And if there was an Australian more worthy of holding up a federal budget, I think it's Warnie.
Absolutely.
Very, very sad and one for us to reflect on. But Ross, I always love catching up with you, and I love sharing the convo with our friends. When we publish this, I'll make sure we tag the previous conversation we have, and I'd love to catch up with you pre the election. Once these the clowns on both sides have announced their policies, let's get together and have a chat. And
it'll be good to analyse them. That would be great. Always good to catch up, Brett, and many thanks for your time today.
Ross, thanks so much. I appreciate it. And as I love to say, have a great day.
Good on you, Brett.
Thanks for listening to the Be Better Off Show. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcasts.
Have a great day.